The fire that destroyed Lancaster Row wasn't an accident. It was an experiment gone wrong, and its echoes still haunted the living. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Before diving into this extraordinary tale, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. Your support helps us bring you more intriguing stories like this. The town of Tindermere was a place where time seemed to stand still. Nestled between rolling hills and shrouded in perpetual mist, it was a town of whispers and half-forgotten memories. Historian Isaac Vellum had always been drawn to its mysteries, but it was the stretch of abandoned shophouses on Lancaster Row that captured his attention most. The buildings stood like relics of a bygone era, their facades untouched by the passage of time, trapped between the towering modern developments that loomed on either side. Isaac had spent months researching the history of Lancaster Row, but the records were sparse. The shophouses had been abandoned for decades, their doors locked and windows boarded up. Yet, there were rumors, whispers of strange lights flickering in the windows at night, of faint voices echoing through the empty halls. Most dismissed these tales as the ramblings of superstitious locals, but Isaac wasn't so sure. He had a feeling there was something more to the story, something hidden beneath the surface. It was during one of his late-night research sessions that he met Marian, an investigative journalist with a reputation for uncovering the truth. Marian had come to Tindermere to write a piece on the town's forgotten history, and she, too, had been drawn to Lancaster Row. The two quickly formed an unlikely partnership, united by their shared curiosity and determination to uncover the secrets of the shophouses. Their first breakthrough came on a cold, foggy evening. Armed with flashlights and a sense of trepidation, Isaac and Marian ventured into one of the abandoned buildings. The air inside was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked beneath their feet. As they explored the dimly lit rooms, they began to notice strange details: a teacup resting on a table, a coat hanging on a hook, a newspaper dated decades ago. It was as if the occupants had vanished in an instant, leaving everything behind. But the most chilling discovery came when they reached the upper floor. There, in the faint glow of their flashlights, they saw them, figures, translucent and shimmering, frozen in mid-motion. A woman stood by a window, her hand raised as if to draw back the curtain. A man sat at a desk, his pen poised above a sheet of paper. A child played on the floor, a toy train clutched in his hands. They were spectral echoes, trapped in the moments before their untimely deaths. Isaac and Marian watched in stunned silence as the figures flickered and faded, only to reappear moments later, repeating the same motions over and over. It was a haunting sight, one that left them both shaken and intrigued. They had uncovered a secret far darker and more profound than they had ever imagined. The shophouses of Lancaster Row were not empty. They were occupied by the echoes of the past, forever trapped in a loop of their final moments. As they stepped back into the cold night air, Isaac and Marian knew they had only scratched the surface of the mystery. The spectral echoes were just the beginning. There was something deeper, something older, lurking at the heart of Lancaster Row. And they were determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. The discovery of the spectral echoes left Isaac and Marian both exhilarated and unnerved. Over the following days, they pored over old records, interviewed elderly residents, and pieced together fragments of the shophouse's history. The more they learned, the more Isaac became convinced that the key to the mystery lay in the oldest shophouse at the center of Lancaster Row. It was a crumbling structure, its facade weathered and its windows dark, but Isaac felt an almost magnetic pull toward it. "There's something about that building," he said one evening as they sat in Marian's cramped rented room, surrounded by stacks of documents and maps. "It's like it's calling to me. The other shophouses are echoes, but that one is the source." Marian frowned, her pen tapping against her notebook. "Isaac, we've seen what's in those buildings. It's dangerous. We don't even know what we're dealing with." "That's exactly why we need to go in," Isaac insisted, his eyes alight with determination. "Don't you feel it? This isn't just some random haunting. There's a pattern, a reason, and it all leads back to that shophouse." Marian sighed, running a hand through her hair. She admired Isaac's passion, but his growing obsession worried her. Still, she couldn't deny the pull of the mystery herself. "All right," she said finally. "But we do this carefully. No reckless moves." "Agreed." Isaac nodded, though his mind was already racing ahead. He spent the next few days preparing, gathering equipment, and studying the shophouse architecture. He became increasingly withdrawn, his thoughts consumed by the building and its secrets. Marian watched him with growing concern, but every time she tried to broach the subject, he brushed her off. "I'm fine," he said one morning when she found him hunched over a stack of blueprints, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "I just need to figure this out. Once we understand what's happening, everything will make sense." Marian hesitated, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "Isaac, you're pushing yourself too hard. This isn't just about the research anymore, is it?" He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "It's never just been about the research," he said quietly. "You know that." The night they finally decided to enter the oldest shophouse, the air was thick with tension. The mist clung to the streets, muffling their footsteps as they approached the building. The door, warped and splintered with age, creaked open with a push, revealing a yawning darkness within. Isaac stepped inside without hesitation, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. Marian followed, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was colder here, heavier, and the silence was oppressive. As they moved deeper into the shophouse, they began to notice the same eerie details they'd seen in the other buildings. Furniture frozen in time, objects left as if their owners had just stepped away. But here, the echoes were different. They were fainter, almost imperceptible, like shadows flickering at the edge of their vision. "Do you see them?" Marian whispered, her voice barely audible. Isaac nodded, his gaze fixed on a faint figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was a man, his face twisted in anguish, his hands clutching his chest as if in pain. As they watched, the figure flickered and vanished, only to reappear moments later, repeating the same motion. "This is it," Isaac said, his voice trembling with excitement. "This is where it all began. We're close, Marian. I can feel it." Marian wanted to believe him, but a sense of dread was settling over her. The shophouse felt alive, its walls pulsing with a strange, almost malevolent energy. She reached out to grab Isaac's arm. "We should go. We can come back tomorrow, with more equipment, more." But Isaac shook her off, his eyes gleaming with a feverish intensity. "No. I need to see this through. You can wait outside if you want, but I'm not leaving." Before Marian could protest, he turned and strode deeper into the shophouse, his flashlight beam bobbing in the darkness. She hesitated, torn between her fear and her loyalty to him. Finally, she followed, her unease growing with every step. They reached a room at the back of the shophouse, its door slightly ajar. Isaac pushed it open, revealing a space that seemed frozen in time. A table was set for a meal, the plates still full, the glasses filled with wine. In the center of the room stood a figure, a woman, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She was reaching out, as if trying to grasp something just out of reach. Isaac stepped closer, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "This is it," he murmured. "This is where it all connects. I just need to." Before he could finish, the air around him seemed to shimmer, like heat rising from asphalt. Marian watched in horror as Isaac's form began to blur, his outline dissolving into the air. She lunged forward, grabbing for his hand, but her fingers passed through empty space. "Isaac," she screamed, but it was too late. He was gone, swallowed by the shophouse's dark embrace. In his place stood a faint, shimmering echo, a spectral version of Isaac, frozen in the moment of his disappearance. Marian stumbled back, her mind reeling. The shophouse had claimed Isaac, just as it had claimed the others. And now, she was alone, facing a mystery far darker and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Marian stood frozen in the dimly lit room, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she stared at the spectral echo of Isaac. His form shimmered faintly, his face caught in an expression of shock and confusion, his hand still outstretched as if reaching for something only he could see. The air around her felt heavy, oppressive, as if the shophouse itself was alive and watching her every move. "Isaac," she whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out, her fingers brushing the air where he had stood moments before. But there was nothing, no warmth, no solidity, just the cold, empty void. The echo of Isaac flickered, repeating the same motion over and over, trapped in an endless loop. Panic surged through her, but Marian forced herself to think. She couldn't afford to lose control, not now. She had to understand what had happened, had to find a way to bring Isaac back. Stepping back, she scanned the room, her flashlight beam darting across the walls, the furniture, the eerie tableau of the spectral woman frozen in terror. Everything felt wrong, as if the room existed outside of time itself. "Think, Marian, think," she muttered to herself, her mind racing. The shop house had taken Isaac, just as it had taken the others. But how? And why? She needed answers, and she needed them fast. She retreated from the room, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The shop house seemed to close in around her, its walls creaking and groaning as if alive. She could feel the weight of its history pressing down on her, the whispers of the past swirling in the air like ghosts. But she pushed the fear aside, focusing on the task at hand. Back in the main room, Marian pulled out her notebook and began jotting down everything she could remember. Isaac's movements, the way the air had shimmered, the look on his face just before he disappeared. She needed to find a pattern, a clue that could explain what had happened. As she worked, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a faint symbol carved into the wall near the doorway. It was small and intricate, almost hidden in the shadows. She moved closer, her flashlight illuminating the design. It looked like a spiral, its lines twisting and turning in on themselves, surrounded by strange, archaic symbols. "What is this?" she murmured, tracing the carving with her fingers. It felt cold to the touch, and as she pressed against it, she felt a faint vibration, like a hum resonating through the wall. The air around her seemed to shift, and for a moment, she thought she heard voices, whispers, faint and indistinct, but filled with urgency. She stepped back, her heart pounding. The symbol was a clue, she was sure of it. But what did it mean? And how did it connect to Isaac's disappearance? Determined to find answers, Marian began searching the rest of the shophouse, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. She found more symbols carved into the walls, each one slightly different, but all sharing the same spiral motif. They seemed to form a pattern, leading her deeper into the building. Finally, she reached a small, hidden room at the back of the shophouse. The air here was colder, the silence more profound. In the center of the room stood an old, ornate mirror, its surface cracked and tarnished with age. The frame was covered in the same spiral symbols, their lines twisting and turning like a labyrinth. Marian approached the mirror cautiously, her reflection distorted by the cracks. As she stared into it, she felt a strange pull, as if the mirror was calling to her. She reached out, her fingers brushing the surface, and suddenly, the room seemed to shift. The air grew thick, and the walls began to blur, their edges dissolving into a swirling mist. Marian stumbled back, but it was too late. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and she felt herself being drawn into it, her body weightless, her mind spinning. When the mist cleared, she found herself standing in a different place. The shophouse was gone, replaced by a bustling street filled with people in old-fashioned clothing. The air smelled of coal smoke and fresh bread, and the sound of horse-drawn carriages clattering over cobblestones filled her ears. She was in the past. Marian's heart raced as she realized what had happened. The shophouse wasn't just haunted, it was a gateway, a place where time folded in on itself. Isaac hadn't disappeared, he had been pulled into the past, just as she had. But where was he? And how could she find him in this strange, unfamiliar world? As she stood there, trying to make sense of her surroundings, she noticed a familiar figure in the crowd, A man in a long coat, his dark hair tousled, his face pale and drawn. It was Isaac. "Isaac," she called, pushing through the crowd toward him. But he didn't seem to hear her. He was staring at something in the distance, his expression one of shock and horror. Marian followed his gaze and saw the shop house, not the abandoned, crumbling building she knew, but a vibrant, bustling shop, its windows filled with goods and its door open to the street. But there was something wrong. The air around it shimmered, and the people passing by seemed to avoid it, their faces filled with unease. Before she could reach Isaac, the scene began to shift again. The street blurred, the people fading into shadows, and the shop house seemed to collapse in on itself, its walls crumbling, its windows darkening. Marian felt herself being pulled back, the past slipping through her fingers like sand. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the shop house, standing in front of the mirror. Her heart was pounding, her mind reeling from what she had seen. Isaac was trapped in the past, caught in a moment of time that refused to let him go. And if she didn't find a way to break the cycle, she would be next. Marian stumbled back from the mirror, her legs trembling as the weight of what she had just experienced settled over her. The shop house was silent once more, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. But the echoes of the past still lingered in her mind. The bustling street, the terrified look on Isaac's face, the way the shop house had seemed to collapse in on itself. She had seen the past, and she had seen Isaac trapped within it. Now, she had to find a way to bring him back. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together what she had learned. The spiral symbols, the mirror, the way time seemed to fold and twist within the shop house, it all pointed to something far more complex than a simple haunting. This was a place where time itself had fractured, where the past and present collided in a chaotic, endless loop. And Isaac was caught in the middle of it. Marian knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed help, someone who understood the town's history, someone who might know more about the shop house and its secrets. She thought of Mrs. Hargrove, the elderly woman who ran the town's tiny museum. Mrs. Hargrove had lived in Tindermere her entire life and was a walking encyclopedia of local lore. If anyone could help, it was her. The walk to the museum was a blur. The mist clung to the streets, muffling the sound of her footsteps, and the town felt eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. When she reached the museum, she found Mrs. Hargrove sitting behind the counter, her glasses perched on the end of her nose as she pored over an old ledger. "Marian, dear," Mrs. Hargrove said, looking up with a warm smile. "What brings you here at this hour?" Marian hesitated, unsure of how to explain what she had seen. "I need your help," she said finally. "It's about Lancaster Row. The shop houses, there's something wrong with them." Mrs. Hargrove's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. She set down her pen and gestured for Marian to sit. "Tell me everything." Marian did, recounting the spectral echoes, Isaac's disappearance, and her journey into the past. Mrs. Hargrove listened in silence, her expression growing graver with each word. When Marian finished, the old woman sighed and leaned back in her chair. "I was afraid this would happen," she said quietly. "The shop houses have always been different. There are stories, old stories, about what happened there. But most people don't believe them anymore." "What stories?" Marian asked, leaning forward. Mrs. Hargrove hesitated, then stood and walked over to a dusty bookshelf. She pulled out an old, leather-bound book and handed it to Marian. "This is the town's history, as recorded by my great-grandfather. There's a chapter about Lancaster Row. Read it." Marian opened the book, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. She found the chapter and began to read. The words were faded, the ink blotched in places, but the story was clear. Decades ago, Lancaster Row had been the heart of Tindermere, a bustling center of trade and commerce. But one night, something terrible had happened. A fire, started in the oldest shophouse, had swept through the row, consuming everything in its path. Dozens had died, their lives snuffed out in an instant. But the fire wasn't the end. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. People reported seeing the victims walking the streets, their forms flickering like candle flames. The shophouses, though rebuilt, were never the same. They became places of sorrow and fear, their doors closing one by one until they were abandoned altogether. Marian looked up, her heart pounding. The echoes, they're the victims of the fire. Mrs. Hargrove nodded.
Yes.
And the oldest shophouse, the one at the center of the row, was where it all began. They say the fire wasn't an accident. They say it was started by a man who dabbled in things he shouldn't have. He was trying to bend time, to undo a terrible mistake. But something went wrong. Marian's mind raced. If the shophouse was a place where time had been fractured, then perhaps Isaac wasn't just trapped in the past. He was trapped in the moment of the fire. And if she didn't find a way to break the cycle, he would be lost forever. I have to go back, she said, standing abruptly. I have to find him. Mrs. Hargrove reached out, grasping her hand. Be careful, dear. The shophouse is a dangerous place. It doesn't let go easily. Marian nodded, her resolve hardening. She didn't have a choice. She had to save Isaac, no matter the cost. Marian returned to Lancaster Row as night fell, the mist thickening around her like a shroud. The shophouses loomed in the darkness, their facades shadowed and foreboding. The oldest shophouse stood at the center, its door slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. She hesitated for a moment, clutching the old book Mrs. Hargrove had given her, then stepped inside. The air was colder now, the silence heavier. The spectral echoes flickered in the corners of her vision, their movements repetitive and haunting. Marian ignored them, focusing on the task at hand. She had to find Isaac and break the cycle before the shophouse claimed her too. She made her way to the hidden room at the back of the building, where the mirror stood. Its surface was still cracked and tarnished, but the spiral symbols on its frame seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Marian set the book down on a nearby table and flipped through its pages, searching for anything that might help her. There, in the final chapter, she found it, a passage describing the man who had started the fire. His name was Elias Vane, a clockmaker who had become obsessed with the idea of controlling time. He had built a device, a strange contraption of gears and mirrors, designed to manipulate the flow of time. But something had gone wrong, and the device had triggered the fire that destroyed Lancaster Row. Marian's eyes widened as she read the description of the device. It matched the symbols she had seen carved into the walls of the shophouse. The spirals, the intricate patterns, they were part of the mechanism Elias had created. And if she could find it, perhaps she could reverse what he had done. She began searching the room, her flashlight beam darting across the walls. Finally, she found it, a hidden compartment in the wall, concealed behind a loose panel. Inside was a small, ornate box, its surface covered in the same spiral symbols. Marian opened it carefully, revealing a delicate arrangement of gears and mirrors, still intact after all these years. Her hands trembled as she lifted the device from the box. It was cold to the touch, and she could feel a faint vibration, like a heartbeat, emanating from it. She knew what she had to do. Marian carried the device to the mirror and placed it on the floor in front of it. She adjusted the gears, following the instructions she had read in the book, and positioned the mirrors to reflect the light from her flashlight. As she worked, the air around her began to hum, the vibrations growing stronger. Finally, she stepped back and activated the device. The gears whirred to life, the mirrors catching the light and refracting it in a dazzling array of colors. The air shimmered, and the room seemed to fold in on itself, the walls dissolving into a swirling mist. Marian felt herself being pulled into the past once more. The shophouse vanished, replaced by the bustling street she had seen before. But this time she was ready. She scanned the crowd, searching for Isaac, and finally spotted him near the oldest shophouse. He was staring at the building, his face pale and drawn. "Isaac," she called, running toward him. This time, he heard her. He turned, his eyes widening in shock. "Marian? What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice trembling. "There's no time to explain," she said, grabbing his hand. "We have to go. Now." She pulled him toward the mirror, the device still humming in her other hand. The air around them began to shift, the past unraveling as the device worked to reverse the flow of time. But the shophouse resisted, its walls trembling as if alive. "Marian, what's happening?" Isaac asked, his voice filled with panic. "Just hold on," she shouted, tightening her grip on his hand. The world around them blurred, the past and present colliding in a chaotic whirlwind. Marian focused on the mirror, on the light refracting through the device, and willed it to take them back. Finally, with a deafening crack, the shophouse released them. They stumbled back into the present, the mirror shattering into 1,000 pieces as the device fell silent. The room was still, the air heavy with the scent of dust and decay. Marian and Isaac collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Isaac turned to Marian, his eyes filled with gratitude and disbelief. You saved me," he said softly. Marian nodded, her heart still racing.
"We're not done yet," she said.
"The shophouse, it's still a danger. We have to expose the truth, make sure no one else gets hurt." Isaac hesitated, then nodded. "You're right. But how?" Marian thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. "We start by telling the story. All of it. The echoes, the fire, Elias Vane's device. The town needs to know what happened here." Together, they left the shophouse, the weight of its secrets heavy on their shoulders. But as they stepped into the cold night air, Marian felt a sense of hope. They had faced the darkness and survived. And now, they had the chance to bring the truth to light. Thank you for diving into our incredible stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more adventures.